Against the backdrop of a volatile Middle East, the new Trump-Iran agreement has sent shockwaves through international diplomacy and global energy markets. Coming as a fragile ceasefire still holds following an unexpected extension brokered through Pakistani mediation, the deal has intensified questions over Washington's strategy and its wider regional commitments. Critics say the United States is now trading away key interests, deepening the strain on its European allies and appearing to bend to the demands of Israeli hardliners, while the economic fallout continues to hit the global south. At the same time, the American political establishment is showing clear signs of division, and Beijing and Russia are watching closely from the sidelines. So is this the beginning of a new multipolar order, or only a temporary lull before the next major escalation? Tonight, we unpack what could be one of the most defining geopolitical shifts of the decade as we examine the Trump administration's diplomatic moves toward Tehran, the uneasy link with the Lebanon truce, the factors inside the US establishment, and the hypocrisy and double standards shaping Western foreign policy. These questions and more are put to my panel of experts tonight on Al24news Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's special coverage with me, Karim Fess Zakari. And to help us unpack these complex dynamics, I am honored to welcome a distinguished panel of experts joining us from across the globe. Ms. Zara Mansoor, security and political analyst based in Islamabad, bringing deep expertise in the Iranian and North Korean nuclear programs. Hello, ma'am, and thank you for being with us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we also have the pleasure to have Professor Miral Sabry, AlAshry, war and conflict reporting expert at the University of East London, joining us from Cairo. Thank you for your time, ma'am, and welcome to the show. We also have the pleasure.
Thank you, Karim.
It's our pleasure. And we also have the pleasure to have Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie, founder and political consultant at Khuzaie Associates, LLC, Washington, D.C. He joins us from Manama, Bahrain. Good to see you again with us, Professor, and thank you for giving us some of your time. We also have the pleasure to have Dr. Irfan Raja, geopolitical analyst and media professional, joining us from London. Thank you, Dr. Raja, for honoring our invitation.
My pleasure, Karim. Thank you so much.
All right, let's start the debate with you, Ms. Zara Mansoor. So let's talk a little bit about the Pakistani mediation that extended this fragile ceasefire. How crucial, according to you, was Islamabad's back-channel diplomacy in preventing a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz? And can this Asian-led mediation hold when Western diplomatic channels have seemingly collapsed under the weight of their own biases, that is?
Pakistan's role was significant and decisive, not just symbolic, and its mediation produced the US-Iran talks and brought two of the unyielding states to the negotiations table, and they were not ready to do it. So Pakistan's high-level officials negotiated face-to-face meeting with J.D. Vance and Witkoff on one side, and then there was the Iranian officials on the other side. No Western power had that access to both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. But to say that it prevented total closure overstates it, because Strait of Hormuz kept closing and reopening even after mediated deals. Iran shut it again hours after announcing that it was open. So Pakistan bought pauses and openings, not control over the choke point itself. And as you said, that can it hold? So to be honest, that Pakistan can convene and de-escalate. It cannot enforce. Islamabad was never going to enforce a settlement on these states, and no mid-sized power could. What it did was harder to build and arguably more valuable. It created the room where Washington and Tehran would sit and negotiate for further regional stability, elements that can bring stability in the region and peace. And that's not the limit of Pakistan's diplomacy, but that's the proof of it. Also, on Western channels collapsing under bias, I would say that it is more accurate that Western diplomacy was reactive. While Pakistan had structural dual trust, it had ties with Washington and also diplomatic proximity to Tehran that the US and EU don't have post 1979. And that's an access gap, not necessarily a moral one.
Thank you for that, ma'am. And now let's move on to Professor Miral AlAshry. Professor Miral Sabry AlAshry, I'm saying, looking at the devastation we saw or we witnessed in Lebanon, in Iran, there has been a glaring contrast in how international law is applied and reported. And perhaps we can hark back even to what happened in Gaza. How do you explain the Western media's double standards here, framing the US and Israeli aggression against Iran, Lebanon, the Israeli military actions in Lebanon as defense, while dismissing the legitimate resistance and the massive civilian toll that has drawn sweeping condemnation from the global South?
Yeah, Karim, the framing of a military action and application with international laws in the Middle East are subject with intention in global debate and also deeper division between Western perspective for the media and those in global South. We can talk about now about Western media framework, defense, and align, like Western media coverage officially and the policy which operate with a framework which is prioritize the state and also establish align with specific definitions of the security. Right for the self-defense with the Western government and the media outlet frequency frame Israeli and U.S. military and action defense with a major perspective of the views within actions as a direct response, such as the rock attacks and non-for-the-state action like Hezbollah in the region and in office with Iran. Under these framework, military operation present as an effort with balance with direct security threat and also protect the civilian populations for incoming fire. About the state versus non-state and action with international laws and historical prioritize the right and responsibility to recognize which is the state and also the narrative to emphasize the group all of the groups of Hezbollah and non-state actor operates outside the center of the authority of the Lebanon with the government, which is complicated, and also the state under the traditional framework, legislate and warfare. About the strategic alliance with the media organization with influence about the geopolitics legislate were their home with the country and because of United States and Western align with a view with Iran, and it's also allowed with the group to establish the foreign regions cover frequency and focus about the threat also inside, as you said, from Lebanon and also in Gaza and affect also the Gulf countries and Middle East. And intensity with a post with a religion was established with also global trend with such as the and putting like restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz. A global south and legal criticized with a double standard with surveillance tools as the governments with legal experts and the global south as well as international human rights organization is differing internships with the Western couple and political significant. We have a double standard. The critique or argue or the experts argue some media coverage does not give enough attention with important groups as international humanitarian law, especially when we need to protect civilians and avoiding using the force. And also that happened in Gaza war when the war started in 2023. This point of the civilians, this for the people and forced to leave their home and also the damage of the hospitality and the home and the public infrastructures in Lebanon, for an example, with humanitarian impact with the military operation. This argues this issue should require and much more attention with investigations and international reporting. And about the right of the resident from the perspective of many nationals with a global South group, with a resident with a foreign military, with the occupation, with a few souls that link with the National Library, with the legitimate defenses, argue these groups should be understood within the historical and political context, including the past conflict with the poor, also deposit, and this can be believed that the description of the residents' attacks ignore the wide war factor. So equal applications with international laws as the center criticized with a global south have been international legal mechanisms which apply significantly, with argue which is the powerful for the country with strong criticized about the violations also, but also less criticized with the similar actors with involved and has been excellent also. This is we can call, we have here a double standard for the media reporting and about the geopolitics with the division with Western medians and all focus on the tribe objective and security justification for the state, while the media and leader for a global south emphasize the humanity or the humanitarian impact and the historical context, which makes the balance
Clear.
as you see for international.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miral.
Thank you.
Now, let me include Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie with this question. Dr. Ahmed, the Trump-Iran deal has faced fierce pushback from pro-Israel hardliners in Washington. Now, from a purely strategic standpoint, to what extent is the American establishment realizing that waging proxy wars for the sole interest of Israel is severely eroding the United States' own geopolitical standing and international legitimacy for that matter?
When it comes to the proxy wars, we have to establish the fact that Iran is the master of these games when it comes to the past at least 46 years in the region. If we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Bahrain, Yemen, and Iraq, amongst other countries. Now, with the relationship between Israel and the United States of America, just like you mentioned right now, there's a debate today around Washington, D.C. and around the world about the shift between both countries, and that there's a big drift that has been taken basically aside when it comes to both countries. Big discussions are being associated with that, along with big drift happening when it comes to the political sides to it. I can tell that lots of caucuses around the United States are either taking side with the war or going against it. Now, when it comes to the United States fighting a war on behalf of Israel, it's not the case, especially after what Donald Trump started last December with Venezuela. Now it's with Iran, next is going to be Cuba, and afterwards we're talking about Greenland. These are still in the books, and I can confirm that it's not merely about Israel, especially that now even the biggest debate in Israel right now are two things. Does the United States of America know what it's involving itself with when it comes to Iran? Both ways, either the war or the deal. And do they still have Israel at heart the way they did before? On the American side, with the midterm elections approaching in November, many are calling it a stunt. They calling that to, or basically attaching that to the Trump administration, which leaves the especially Republicans scattered with the upcoming elections, or sidelined, especially that even if they're going to have the seats, they're not going to vote for the Republican Party.
Mhm. So what you're mentioning is that there is division inside, the U.S. Establishment, and of course you mentioned the Republicans and the Democrats. But then, if you come to look closer at the situation, the only person who could actually gain from the mess in the Middle East is Israel. And Donald Trump, according to a lot of experts, was dragged into this war, and he could have done without it. And why are we seeing another deal with Iran that looks pretty much the same like GCPOA?
You're correct. It's exactly what we've been discussing, and I've been publishing lots of pieces about that. Exactly. When Donald Trump started this war, he mentioned clearly that it will be much better than the GCPOA, or as he mentioned, better than the Obama deal. Today, as we stand, especially that what we have today is an MOU, which is just merely an intent. It's not a deal. It's not the end of it. It could even reinstigate things within hours, if not days. Besides, the conditions in this MOU is not binding legally as much as it's not fair to the rest of the parties. You mentioning Israel in this mix, basically, it's bad for the region, and here I'm talking about the Gulf as much as Israel, to leave things as they are. Um, the GCPOA was not fair for anybody, especially that one of the terms was that enrichment level should not exceed 3.6%, although it reached more than 40 to 60%, depending on the facility. When it comes to agreeing and leaving things undone or half done, especially when it comes to Iran, it will put the Gulf, which we already are, in a big trouble with Iran. Prior to the war, the Gulf states created some kind of a status quo. It was not perfect, but it was working for everybody. Now, with the United States thinking of leaving the region, it will leave the wounded Iran even more aggressive against the Gulf states and even more aggressive towards Israel. That's why Israel is agitated. The Gulf are unsettled when it comes to the deal, especially that both sides, and here I'm talking about Israel and the Gulf states, are not included directly in the deal. Yes, Qatar was mediating today in Geneva. Pakistan is there, and Pakistan was as well taken into heart the goodwill of the Gulf states, yet it's not enough. Things should reach an ultimatum rather than being left in the middle as they are, because they will create even more problems in the days to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie. Now, let me bring Dr. Irfan Raja. Dr. Irfan Raja, the US is actually scrambling to put out the fire in the Middle East and coerce Iran with sanctions and blockade. Meanwhile, we have China and Russia who have quietly consolidated their influence in the region. How does this US led chaos and the eventual desperate pivot to a deal inadvertently accelerate China's dominance, for example, and expose the waning grip of American superpower rivalry?
Thank you, Karim. Actually, you see, like the Americans have a long history of going into wars. So far, they have, according to the authentic statistics, there are more than around 500 interventions, including regime change operations and all that. So Americans have never rested because war is business for them. Their economy is based on war. You see, now, once again, the war on Iran, which has arguably been fought to shield Israeli interests and to serve Israeli interests. Once again, the U.S. after a deal, it looks like they are leaving, as the professor mentioned, they're leaving Middle East in chaos because we can see so far this war, the amount of disaster, the human life, as well as the economic loss of the war. So you see, this Iran war has actually exposed the limits of American power, and they also it exposed divisions among the American government as well as the public, because now the new debates emerge as soon after this deal and during the deal, is the debates emerging inside America is the coming war, civil war, because there's 1% who profitized from the war as usual. They are becoming richer and richer, while the other ordinary people, they are suffering inside America. I'm talking about. There's, the America is on a, I would say, suicidal ladder, because this war they already have lost on several fronts, on moral front, on economic front. It costly war, one of them in over $50 billion they lost, more than that. And as you can see on technical side, and tech, if you say, the Middle East has been a battleground, or a tech battleground, and which China is dominating. Chinese have shown, and they are behind Iran. They shown their tech during the last year's war between India and Pakistan, when the Pakistanis shot down Rafales. And now here you have Iranians have shot down F-35s, which is the first ever time here in Middle East. And there's many scores of examples. To cut it short and briefly speaking, the Americans have lost the war. Is not the first time since the fall of Kabul, and so many examples. They have lost the war, and what happened as a result, the Chinese in the last 40 years, the China has never been aggressor. What they were doing is, and nor they have applied any policy of fair trade or whatever, they have been working closely with different nations, and they are dominant trade partners in Europe, in Africa. I would briefly end up with a very good analysis by Professor Kishore Mehbubani, who is one of the leading figures. And his analysis is a textbook example of how the rise of China is not it's real. And the reasons behind, there are multiple factors, several reasons, and some of the key reasons is like America internal dysfunctions, and its strategic errors. This you can count war on Iran is one of the major strategic error. So that is why it's the Americans have themselves, they allows China to rise, because they have been investing heavily in arms. They have been invading nations, sovereign nations. Before Iran, they just march into Venezuela, and but the Chinese have never done this. So you're equally right that to say that the Russians and Chinese have won this war once again, not on militarily front, but also on technologically and on moral front, because people inside Europe, people inside Israel, they are against war. People who are in the global south, everyone want peace, because peace is the only solution. That's why Pakistanis, actually, I must add a word, what your guest in Islamabad said. Pakistanis, yes, it's true, they brought two powers together, but at the same time, they were being backed and supported by Chinese, by Saudis, by Turkey. So they were not alone, and they still have leverage. They are very powerful in this, all this. So I would end up this to say that, the Cold War mindset and this invasions and regime change and all these tactics has failed. So there's clearly it's writing on the wall. China is rising.
Thank you. And now, coming back to you, Ms. Zara Mansoor, you do possess extensive expertise in both Iranian and North Korean nuclear ambitions. Now, Tehran's insistence on unfreezing assets and lifting sanctions before making concessions mirrors somewhat past North Korean tactics. Now, has Iran effectively weaponized the threat to global supply chains to force the United States into a corner, successfully utilizing the Pyongyang playbook?
First, I would like to mention the point which Dr. Irfan Raja said, that Pakistan has been backed by several other states, including Qatar, there was Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and several other states. So that was a good point, and I realized after my argument that I did not mention it. So thank you for adding it. Coming towards my answer, that yes, there are similar tactics between Iran and North Korea, but different weapon. North Korea used its nukes as leverage, and Iran used its grip on the Strait of Hormuz the same way. Uh, it threatened the world's oil supply, demanded relief before giving anything up. So Iran asked for sanctions lifted and assets unfrozen first, and promise concessions later. And it's a classic North Korean example sequencing. It is a copied move. So Iran got real talks and real incentives on the table without giving up its gold leverage early. And where it is weaker than North Korea's version is that it is closing Hormuz, which hurts Iran and its neighbors. So the pressure has a built-in limit. North Korea's nukes never cut both ways like that. In simple, that Iran borrowed the Pyongyang playbook, but its weapons has a self-destruct clock North Korea's never did.
Lovely. Now, let's bring Professor Miral Sabry AlAshry again. The international political class, Professor Miral, and the elites outside the West have heavily condemned the blatant violations of sovereignty during this escalation. Now, has the weaponization of sanctions and the shielding of Israel by the US fundamentally destroyed the credibility of international law, according to you, in the eyes of the global South, that is?
Really, many legal scholars, diplomatic, and leaders from a global and the South arguing about the credibility about the international laws, which is damaged. What they say is we have a systematic double standards in the law, and we saw that in Gaza war. Firstly, about the selective enforcement, like criticize, argue about the international rules was always applied and equal. They claimed that while the Western country have support with strong legal action, sanctions, and against some state of the advance about the violation, like what happened in Lebanon, in Gaza, and have also protected alliance and also including Israel former similar pressure through political influence with UN and Security Council. Weaponization of the conflict and sanctions. Some countries and global South argue that Western of the sanctions or the phrasing and also phrasing for the assaults, like what happened in Iran, are not only this is the tool to enforcement the international rules, but also can be used for political pressures against Iran. They believe that we can go to finance and systematic givens to the Western country created to influence. It has also encouraged some nationals to support alternative, just as reducing depending on US dollars and economy with collaboration through groups like BRICS. Erosion with humanitarian norms, many violence of the South and the global South argues that we have high number of civilians deaths starting from 2023 until now, large scale and displacement and the damage to civilians for the infrastructures and what happened. We saw that in Lebanon and in Gaza, a lot of scenarios and concern about equal protections of civilians under international humanitarian law that argue can use to the weapons and also the supplies with a Western country created questions about the responsibility and accountability. Who's responsible about that? Who? Okay, so this is an active about the international court and using international law instead of the rejecting and international law. Many countries outside the Western country use international legal institution a challenge that believes that the violence with the global rules. What is examples happened in South Africa case against Israel, we saw it with International Court Justice ICJ, and has been supported by several countries in the Middle East also, and to span Middle East, and shows that many globals for the South national still have never used international courts and did not take any action seeking for accountabilities and who's responsible about the civilians, how many people died in Gaza war. Okay, so shifting about the legal authority here, many countries in the global south are play a large role in shaping with a discussion with international laws. Decisions about the public opinion from international institutions and international court of justice are being used these countries to challenge with a long-term occupation and support legal accountability. However, I think the argument about that decision, it's very difficult to enforce when it's a powerful force that do not support any implementation and do not support the civilians and the people inside, like in Gaza or in Lebanon. So the damage, yeah, so
Amazing.
the damage for many leaders in Africa, Asia, Latin America argues that the aims is not with the weaken with international laws with the majority, but also they believe that the global crisis have increased and called also for reforming about the United Nations Security Council, especially when they are challenging and current with a veto system that give us a small number for the powerful for the country and influencing with international decision.
Clear.
So that can destroy, yes, that can destroy everything and that can destroy the right for civilians. So here we have double standards for international laws. Who's responsible about that? Actually,
Thank you,
many
Dr.
scholars, they
Miral.
don't have.
Thank you,
Yes.
thank you. The point is clear. Now, let me get back to Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie. Dr. Ahmed, we're seeing unprecedented internal opposition, as we mentioned earlier, with the US establishment regarding this deal. So, are these hardliners acting out of genuine concern for American national security, or is this panic driven by the realization that their long-standing and conditional military and diplomatic cover for Israel is no longer sustainable without collapsing the US economy?
Mostly, as we mentioned earlier in the discussion, mostly with the American politicians today, either siding with or against the war, or in relations to funding the war. When it comes to funding either Israel or any other country, or as well selling the arms to other countries. It's all based on the upcoming elections, be it from Democratic side or Republican side. It's a do or die, as the Americans are calling it today. Today, the Republicans basically sustain a majority in 3 houses. The trilateral, basically, winning that they achieved during the presidential elections and as well later on. Today, they are facing the biggest danger of all of losing this majority in both houses. When that happens, it will indicate that the upcoming presidential elections will be won by a Democrat just because the war was fought. That's on one hand. On the other hand, you have the Democrats as well as Republicans who are on the fence when it comes to the war. This shows us that there's a big fragment when it comes to the current war. Now, if we're talking about the economy, if we're talking about what's in it for each of the parties or each of the states that consist the United States of America, we see lots of fragmented decisions, big shifts in ideas, especially, as you mentioned as well, that the Americans want what's best for them internally compared to what's best for the world externally. That's why the midterm elections are mostly, and I'm talking about, as per the numbers, it's 95% about internal matters, not external factors. Therefore, the American people don't want the war. They want what's best for them. They want lower oil prices. They want bigger support for either the healthcare system, schooling. We're talking about as well all the other programs that they are sustaining.
So it's not really that far that this domestic political calculations actually is not really that affecting the memorandum with Iran. You're saying that they care about the immediate effects of their economy, but then what about this deal, Dr. Khuzaie? Isn't it the midterms elections and this, woes, let's call them woes, domestic economic woes, that pushed Donald Trump toward this memorandum of understanding, although we have a lot of pushback inside.
Yes, we spoke about the pushback, domestically, but the biggest influence on what the United States is doing is its own economy, as well as its relations with the outside world, be it Israel, be it the Middle East as a whole. If we're talking about the Gulf, we're talking about especially Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, as well as China and Russia, let alone the European Union as well. I mean, all of that is what's pushing them to do what's best for them in relations to these countries. But the majority of it is not internal, it's external. Because just like one of the panelists mentioned earlier about the economy, when it comes to the economy, are we talking about the economy of the American people, or are we talking about the economy of the few that are benefiting from the war?
Mm-hmm. But then it's undoubtedly, Dr. Khuzaie, if we come to look at this situation, it seems that the United States kind of confused military success with strategic victory in the Middle East. How would you see this reading?
Not really, because initially, during the first month and a half of the war, the biggest beneficiary out of the war was Russia when it comes to the oil prices. Yet now, down the line, who's benefiting is directly the United States of America, not the American people. I'm talking about the state itself, because it's the exports. They became number one exporters of oil, with the Gulf not being able to export at full throttle. We're talking about the oil prices. We're talking about as well the gas and the international trade with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about the insurance companies that increase their prices, which means increase their profits, as well as the oil companies, oil discovery companies. As a whole, yes, the United States of America is benefiting out of it, but their allies are not as much. And that's what's creating the drift between the United States of America and its allies in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. And not just the Middle East, also Europe. And here it leads me to the next question to Dr. Irfan Raja. The economic fallout of the Strait of Hormuz disruptions has hit European energy markets exceptionally hard, deepening the stagflation. So, why does Europe continue to align with the US foreign policy that actively undermines its own economic survival and energy security?
Well, Europe is actively reassessing its alignment, and as all countries does, because it's obviously every country look into its own interests. So you see, first of all, the America under Donald Trump has lost the trust of its alliances, its allies as well, because in the morning Donald Trump says something else, in the evening he changes his position. And also the war in Ukraine in Europe is the best example to say, because in a sense, the Russia is winning this war. They already have won it, according to several experts. And in that case, the Donald Trump has openly, warned Europe that it is their war and it's nothing to do with America. Well, they were the one who started it. And then you see the trade tariffs on Europe, and then comes the another threatening behavior of President Donald Trump, when he openly asked that he is going to take Greenland by force. And this is what he was mentioning to his European allies, who have been allies in the war on terror, in all its Americans' illegal wars in the Middle East, in South Asia and Afghanistan. And, the Pakistan is one of the factories of those wars. So here, Europe is, you see, that is one of the reasons this is the first time the war on the general on side, the war on Gaza, say the ongoing genocide in Gaza, on that there's a clearly split. Look at Spain, look at Ireland. So their position is clear. And that is also another front. You see, the most recent data shows that the European public, ordinary people, they are against these all kinds of illegal wars. And here, the Europe is actively seeking an alternative of energy, of economy, and they are moving towards China. You asked me, the previous question, and I would add that the China is winning in Europe as well, and you will see in the years to come. And it's not so. Hence, in brief, like you see all the leading European figures. I'm talking about Natalie Tokchai, the Vice President of European Commission. She said that we need to know and to show to ourselves and to our partners that we are able to live up to our own government's rules and laws. This is an indication that the Europe is looking for a change in their strategy and more dependent on themselves rather than on America.
Mhm. Lovely. Let's shift the focus now to the Global South with you, Ms. Zara Mansoor. The Global South is suffering immensely from energy price spikes caused by Western-led instability in the Middle East. Now, beyond the immediate Pakistani mediation, what mechanisms are these developing nations trying to build to protect themselves from being collateral damage in a US-Israeli-driven geopolitical war?
Honestly, I think the premise needs a correction a little bit that there is not yet a real protective mechanism, and Pakistan itself is the proof. As it mediated the ceasefire while simultaneously it faced its own fuel shortages from the same war. And it tells you that diplomatic leverage and economic installations are two entirely different things. Pakistan got a seat at the table and it did not get itself out of the fuel queue. Same is the case with India, a major regional power, and it still saw LPG shortages, people switching to kerosene and wood industries shutting down in Gujarat. So what you are seeing right now is not a coordinated global South protective architecture. It is that individual countries are hedging on their own in different directions with different levels of success. So India is leaning into renewables right now, and domestic gas connections are real, but that's a slow insulation strategy. On the other hand, there is Philippines that stood up a crisis committee to manage shortages reactively, and then Gulf states with pipeline infrastructure, including Saudi Arabia, and then there's UAE. They are rerouting oil around Hormuz entirely. So Pakistan's diplomatic role shows that these states can gain leverage at the negotiating table.
Mhm. Amazing. Now, Professor Miral Sabry AlAshry, the US frequently uses economic sanctions as a blunt instrument. Now, when we look at the humanitarian impact on Iran and Lebanon, isn't the rhetoric of targeted diplomacy merely a veneer for economic warfare that intentionally punishes civilian populations to achieve political ends? How would you read it?
And the effects of the economic sanctions of the civilians are the major topic to debate in international relations. Some argue that sanctions are necessary tools to pressure for the government and also change to harmful politics. And the other believe that the sanctions can also hurt directly with the people by damaging the economy, and limitations of access for the resource can create a humanitarian problem. That debate focusing about the sanctions are effect and also their cost to the civilians are justified. So we can divide it about the sanctions of economic and warfare, including many human rights organizations such as UN, especially reporters and the governments in the global south, argue that the term of target diplomacy and makes the strategic also of the collaborative and the punishment is a poor argument to the perspective, including also the systematic of humanitarian collapse, while the sanctions of all techniques to aim for the government entities for the military countries also, or specific sectors for the macroeconomic effects, such as hybrid inflation also, or the currency. They also can changing the currency for the deviations for the currency. And that happened after the 1 week from the world, everything is increased. The price here, for example, in Cairo, it's increased, and also beside us, like Jordan and also in Lebanon. So the praising also for the foreign resources and also damage for the civilians' standard living. In Iran, as a long term for the sanctions can economic pressures for them and also contribute to the challenges for the area like a health care, for example, and foods and medicine. About the effect for the chilling effect, even when the sanctions allow for such as for the humanitarian need like food and medicine, and also many banks shaping with a company and supplier avoiding working with these sanctions in the country because they are fearing from the penalties, what the penalties will be against those companies as external to make difficult for the civilians, which is important for medical support. About the political beliefs also, we can argue some about maximum pressures for the politicals are designed not only to target the government, but also to create economy pressure on the society, because in that case, some companies can increase and reduce also the price. That claims that several economies with hardship may be intent and increase the public dissatisfactions and also push the government to change their political and from their perspective also.
So it's a means of
Yeah.
pressure that could be applied by a given superpower, so as perhaps the people could, stand up against their governments. But this has failed in the case of Iran. And here, Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie, President Donald Trump has threatened massive tariffs, and of course, he waged a lot of sanctions before. Now, if these negotiations fail, is this a sign of diplomatic strength when we see him threatening about the tariffs and other sanctions, or rather a desperate coercive tactic from an administration that has run out of legitimate political capital and military leverage, and in this case in the Middle East?
It has many layers. The first one would be his own reflexive strategy dealing with Iran. We've seen how the Iranian, basically states media have been behaving over the past 40 to even 50 years ago, where each of the officials would come with a contradiction of a statement compared to the other one. Let's say the Ayatollah, the late Ayatollah, would come with a peaceful approach to a matter, and then the president would come to something else, and then the RGC would come very aggressive dealing with it. Since the war of last year, exactly, of the 12th Day War, that started to change the behavior of Donald Trump when dealing specifically with Iran, not with anything else. That gave him some kind of a confusion leverage, especially when it comes to the Iranian people. His main tactic was to push the Iranian, basically, communities to stage an uprising, and that's what he mentioned clearly at the beginning of this war, which never happens. And if you allow me, this didn't happen because of the Iranian fragmentation system. The majority are Persians. Then you have, of course, a little bit of Arabs, around 9 to 10%, the Lurs, the Kurds, the Azeris, the Baluchis, amongst other minorities. None of them as an opposition even to the government, either in exile or within Iran, work together. Can you imagine all these groups work against each other? That's why the Iranian government, the Iranian system is not really scared of the opposition, no matter which opposition it is. Besides the fact that they're not armed, except for the Baluchis, they don't bear arms, hence it's not easy for them to conduct that. Now, when it comes to the economic pressure that he's applying, it's a wish by the Americans that the more pressure they apply economically, the inflation will rise, which today reached between 100 to 500 to some products, not all products, but to some products it reached up to 500%. But will that create an uprising? I don't think so.
Very nice. Now, Dr. Irfan Raja, let's get back to what many are calling hypocrisy and unreliability of Western financial systems, especially during this crisis, which has actually accelerated the BRICS nations' push for de-dollarization, or at least the use of local currency. Now, is this Trump-Iran deal and the surrounding economic warfare the final catalyst needed to break the US dollar's hegemony over global energy markets, at least?
Yes, inside America, leading figures, I would mention one of those, Professor Wolf. They are with the view that the Iran war in Iran is the end of the petrodollar, and this is happening for last couple of months. The debate gets momentum on the mainstream politics and academia. So yes, you see, like the Iran war has given choice to Chinese and Russians, not only to buy and Indians and some other states. The Iranians are accepting the payment in alternative currencies, for example, in yuan. And if you see by the end of last year, by the end of 2025, the statistics shows that China was importing almost about 1.4 million barrels per day. And so with this, which represents almost 13% of its total crude oil, and some 80 to 90% of the Tehran oil's export. So you see, this is the situation there. And throughout this war, that's why the Chinese silently behind, on the diplomatic front as well, and also on this front that U.S. can't force China to stop buying the Iranian oil, and that is one example. And then you can see the Russians. They are being exporters of the Iranian oil, so along with other countries. So in a sense, yes, there are authentic evidence, piles of evidence, which show that the end of petrodollar era, and most of these things are rooted in the American hypocrisy. Because look, what they are doing in Venezuela, invading a sovereign nation and taking over the oil and all natural resources. And then on the other hand, they are dictating and lecturing countries, sovereign nations like Iran and other nations in the Middle East and beyond. So this strategy backfired. It is not did not work at this time, and that is it. So hence, most of the leading figures, like in academia and experts like in politics, media figures, they are with this view that this is the end of petrodollars.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Irfan Raja. And now, as a last question to you, Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie, what has this war done actually? What has it achieved? And when we come to look at the end results, especially in the Middle East, what kind of realignments are we talking about here?
Well, it has proven that everybody in the world should have more than one ally. Nobody should rely on one friend in today's world, basically. Europe has been sidelined, especially after the Russian-Ukrainian war. They have been weakened. Then after the NATO's weak approach to the whole matter since last year, and Trump's approach towards Europe has been very aggressive. That has put Europe at a very tough situation. Canada as well has been sidelined, just like Europe. The United States found more allies over the past, let's say, 40 years compared to losing them over the past 1 year. They have an issue with Israel. They have an issue with the Middle East as a whole. fighting a war, now signing an MOU that has no significant meaning when it comes to anything, I think it's a sign of weakness more than it's a sign of resolving issues. Venezuela last year, then we spoke about his intents for Cuba as well. The professor mentioned something about the economy when it comes to China and Russia. I don't see the end of this year will end on a positive note as much as we hope for. Things are being polarized. Everybody is taking a different line or a different side than how 2025 ended. On that note, we have to understand that economy is changing, military powers are shifting, and the world is full of surprises, and things could change in a minute.
Thank you. And we have to leave it there. So I want to extend my deepest gratitude and thanks to our esteemed guests, Ms. Zara Mansoor in Islamabad, Professor Miral Sabry AlAshry in Cairo, Dr. Ahmed Khuzaie in Manama, and Dr. Irfan Raja in London. Thank you all for your incisive analysis. Now, to summarize, the recent developments and the controversial Trump-Iran deal expose a world in profound transition as Washington struggles to balance its domestic hardliner pressures and unconditional support for Israel with the harsh realities of global energy demands. It is clear that the traditional unipolar order is fracturing. The Global South, led by unprecedented regional mediations, stepping up to prevent absolute economic catastrophe. The West is facing an undeniable reckoning regarding its diplomatic double standards and waning geopolitical supremacy. Thank you, dear viewers, for watching this special coverage on Al24news channel. Stay tuned to more updates, and until now, goodbye.